Well, hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for our next episode of Mixed Messages with Jeff Bogue. My name is Joe Caruso. I'll be your host as we dig into today's topic. Boy, it seems like from news sources to comedians, from friends to advertisements, it seems everyone has an idea of how we should think, how we should live, how we should make decisions. Well, even the experts sound convincing and they often disagree, so how do we cut through the noise? When information overload leaves us frustrated, how do we sift through it all? And how do we choose what actually governs our lives? Well, here at Grace, our leadership continues to process and pray about these things, and we want to offer this resource to navigate some of today's most pressing topics and questions. Jeff,
yes.
It's good to see you.
It's
good to hear you. How are you?
Good, thank you.
So if you're on YouTube, you see us. If you're on our podcast, he looks better than ever.
If you're on YouTube, you're welcome.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
That's where.
Feel free to take a screenshot of this.
Oh man, we're always getting in trouble. It's so good. Well, hey, today our topic is actually responding to one of the questions from our listeners. And this is kind of a fun one. And so this person says this. They say, "I'm really loving the podcast. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Hats off to you, etc. Gracias, merci." Okay, I'm done. But this says, "Keep up the great content." But so I took your advice probably a month and a half ago, we recommended pretty strongly to check out the series The Chosen.
Yeah.
It's really, really great, and that's what they said. It's truly amazing. So thanks for that. The question that they wanted to ask was, why don't the Gospels mention Jesus having a sense of humor or laughing? And so they continue, since we as humans are images of God, we can extrapolate, this person's thinking big, they can extrapolate that Jesus did laugh and joke, and it's wonderful that this is brought to light in the series. And by portraying Jesus this way, it just made him more approachable and relatable. It helps him. So why is it that we don't seem to see that directly, kind of in black and white in the text, that Jesus laughed, Jesus told a joke, Jesus, did these things? Like, Jeff, how do we discover some of that, or did this series just make it up?
No, actually a lot of it's in the text, but it wouldn't be denoted that way, right?
Sure,
so because the text is not narrative, it's historical. So this is what Jesus said, and this is where he went. And so part of that's just the way that the Bible is structured and set up. But it's there. Where you're going to find humor and joy and Jesus being fun, you almost have to jump into the culture deeply.
Sure.
And so where he was in the culture, the things he did, how that would have been perceived. One of my favorite characteristics about Jesus is he's kind of snarky, which is how I am most Christ-like. But like you'll see it in there, but you kind of got to be like a student of the culture. So it's no different than like when I go to Brazil or Africa or someplace like that, and they're speaking a different language. It's always a handicap for me because I can't joke around.
Right.
So joking around is so cultural, it's so quick, it's dry, it's tones of voices, all those kind of things. And when you move outside of a language parameter and move outside of a cultural context, like you don't get it at all. I remember one time, were you with me? I was in Haiti. And
I
do you
know
remember
this story,
about the
but
frog?
I wasn't there.
So I went to Haiti, and it's one of our. In fact, it was our first trip to Haiti, and we went down to Haiti, and we're kind of like exploring what we can do, and we're way, way up in the mountains. It was just this crazy trip. The trip in itself is a long story, but we're way, way up in the mountains, and I'm preaching at this church, this rural church, and we're staying like at this compound up in the mountains. And working on it and working with the people and doing medical clinics and all that kind of stuff. Well, the night before, one of our doctors who was there doing a medical clinic was asleep. And in the middle of the night, a tree frog jumped and landed like smack on his face and like sucked to his face. And so he jumped up, like freaked him out. He jumped up and he's trying to get this tree frog off of him. He's half asleep and freaking out. The guys are all freaking out. There's no electricity, so they're having trouble figuring out how to get the lights on. It's just this hilarious story of your friend, right? So the next day, I was asked to preach at this church, and so I'm preaching at this church, and I tell this story, and I'm like, I'm so glad it happened because I thought this story is going to kill, and everybody's going to think I'm the amazing, hilarious guy in Haiti. And so I'm telling the story, the missionary is translating for me, and then I'm like, the frog attacked him and he ran around, and it was hilarious. And I mean, nothing. The people like stared at me and didn't laugh. I mean, nothing. And the translator was even like being animated, like caught, and I'm like, wow. So I finished the sermon, and we're at lunch later, and I'm talking to the translator, and I looked at him and I go, hey, I said, do Haitians have like a good sense of humor? He's like, oh yeah, they're hilarious. I'm like, they are? He's like, yeah. And I go, well, are they kind of uptight in church? He goes, oh no. He goes, they love to laugh in church. I'm like, huh. I said, because I thought that story was so funny. He goes, oh. He goes, well, he goes, Haitians believe frogs are demons. So when you said the demon attacked your friend's face, they thought it was a voodoo thing, and they couldn't understand why you didn't finish the point about casting the demon out of the... I'm like, oh.
That's amazing.
So,
oh man, you were with me one time where that happened in the reverse, where we were introducing ourselves in the Central African Republic to a very large like pavilion of children. I mean, if I had to guess, it was probably 800 kids. Seriously, it was huge. And we were kind of going down the line. Hi, my name's Jeff. I'm a pastor, and there was a Sean and John, doctor and engineer, and I just happened to be at the end of the line. I'm like, and you guys were saying, I'm married and I have this many kids. Well, it got to me, and I was pretty recently married. I didn't have any kids yet. And I said something like, I'm Joe. I've been married with my wife for, let's call it 5 years, and I don't have any kids yet, but I have 2 dogs. And the room erupted in laughter. And I'm like, I have no clue what I just said that was so funny. So, it's that the context of where you're at gives you a lot of background.
And so in the Bible, you're going to go, you got to go back a couple thousand years and understand the historical context. And you got to understand the Middle Eastern context. Then you got to understand a Jewish context. Mm-hmm. And then you got to understand like the context of Jesus' relationships with his disciples, Yeah. And so that's why it's there. And like when you do something like The Chosen, those guys would have done all of that research and understood the tone of that Greek word or the tone of that Aramaic word and done the math on it. But what's fun with Jesus, when you understand that stuff, you start to see it. So the great place to see this, and in fact, this is in The Chosen, is in the wedding in Canaan when he and the disciples are invited to the wedding. And so I thought they did a really good job capturing that. Like those weddings are celebrations.
Absolutely.
And there's dancing and there's festivals, and it's just like if your life group had a party, like, you're going to be laughing and something's going to happen and it's going to turn into a joke for 5 years. And so the fact that Jesus was invited to that and his followers were invited to that actually makes a very strong statement. Even when Jesus turned the water into wine, a lot of what drove Mary's request for that is that massive social faux pas was happening. Yep. That they would have run out of wine. So you see it in places like that, and you see God's sense of humor and God's joy and all those things, and it plays out in those ways a lot of times.
And even if you think about what kids are drawn to. I don't see many kids running up to the grumpy old men or to the mean old ladies, and so when you see those passages that the kids wanted to get to Jesus, they wanted to be with him, and the disciples were not errantly, but they were trying to keep away. If they didn't want to be around Jesus, that would have been easy, but they wanted to be there, and that in and of itself tells you about his personality.
He gets mom that when you talk about kids running people, one of our interns here is an incredibly sharp guy. His name's Dwayne Reed. Children run to him.
Yes, they do.
They hug him. They cling to him, and there's something about Dwayne's personality. Yep. Where the kids feel safe. They want to laugh with him. They tease him. He teases them back. And so it's exactly that kind of stuff. Like you do all that math not because it's written down, but because you can kind of see it and understand it. I think where Jesus is so deeply misrepresented is in the religious context that he is presented.
Sure. Yep.
And so, whenever we hear the voice of God, and I bring the children unto me, it's like creepy almost. And then so much of worship and religious stuff is sobriety, demanding.
Sure.
This whole idea that you don't laugh in church, you don't, you talk about the joy of the Lord, but you do it academically, not like personally.
Right.
That's all false.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all a false presentation of the heart and mind of Christ. I guess there's probably some kind of control in there or something, but it's mostly just this messed up thing. And that's the way that it's presented in our culture. That's what you're going to see in the average movie. Usually the priest is the bad guy. The spiritual thing is the creepy thing. It's that kind of stuff. And it just causes us to get preconceived ideas that just aren't actually true. The Bible says God gets up and sings over us every morning. Mm-hmm. The Bible would use parables like the lost son that the father's waiting was filled with joy. Mm-hmm. When people come home, you read the Psalms, they're full of celebration, and they're full of lament and sorrow also, but it's really just reflective of the human heart and all this wonderful celebration. The Bible says the joy of the Lord is my strength. Yep. On and on and on and on and on. And it's usually just been painted incorrectly for us because we're usually being told how we're sinning and not measuring up, and we are taught to assume that's the heart of God.
Yeah, that's fantastic. If I had to guess, if the Gospels were represented in Instagram, you don't often capture the actual life moments on camera.
Yeah.
And so when you're just writing down, this is what happened, you're not writing down, and then he told this joke. And then the guy fell off the stool. You don't write that stuff down, but that's the life that happens when you're together and you're building those relationships, and all of that stuff, like you said, Jeff, is woven into his life.
Yeah. And it's there. And, some of this is a challenge, I think, for Christ followers. I think there's a difference between joy and happiness. Mm-hmm. And so joy is usually deep down. It's anchored in our soul. It's tied to contentment and peace, all those kind of things. I think it's also good to be happy. And I think, here at Grace, we laugh a lot in church. I think singing about that, celebrating the joy of the Lord, enjoying God enjoys you. I think it's a challenge a little bit to Christ followers to even present Christ in a different way and in that welcoming manner.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic, and it's reassuring. And as we kind of, if you're listening to this kind of in real time, we're here in the middle of the holidays, and that's even a big thing to be reminding ourselves about. Could barely get that out of my mouth, but reminding ourselves about in terms of how we interact with God. And so as you kind of pray about this, as maybe you dig into the Gospels in particular and try to start seeing some of those moments of who Jesus is, and pray about God helping reveal part of his joy and love and personality as you read. And like we recommended, and this listener totally latched onto, watch The Chosen. It's a fantastic 8-episode series that kind of dives into the life of Jesus. And I'm actually excited. They're actually filming season 2 right now, which is really exciting as well.
Grab the kids, use it as family devotions for a week or two. It really is. I don't recommend Christian broadcast stuff hardly ever. It really is good.
It's fantastic. Yeah. I agree. Well, thanks for joining us today. If you have questions like this listener had, you can always submit them at bath.gracechurches.org/mixed messages. Or if you need to reach out to our team, you can always let us know. You can subscribe, you can follow, you can send us direct messages and engage us that way. Always feel free to join us on the weekend if you're here in town, here at the Bath campus or any of our campuses in the area or in other states. And of course, if you need to, you can join us online as well. Well, thanks for jumping in with us today as we continue to seek God's voice through all the mixed messages around us. We'll see you next week.